Okay, picture this. It's Christmas Day, 1956. A baby girl is born in a hospital in Germany, but she has no ears. Doctors are confused. Her parents are heartbroken, and no one has a clue what caused it. And unfortunately, she was just the beginning. Thousands of babies would be born with similar or even worse deformities. And the reason? A safe little pill given to pregnant women to help with morning sickness. What started out as a miracle drug turned into the biggest pharmaceutical disaster the world has ever seen. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. I may have shed some tears researching this video, but you guys have been requesting it and I've been putting it off long enough, so grab your tissues and let's jump right in. Oh, and you guys know how amazing I am at pronouncing big words, and German words in particular are my specialty. So I worked extra hard to try to get these right for you guys today, so y'all will have to let me know how I do with that. And one last thing, some of these companies that I'm talking about today still exist. So let's just say everything in today's video is alleged, but it does come from very public sources, many of which I will link in the little box down below this episode. So go check it out and form your own opinion.
Every doctor, every hospital, every nurse have been notified. Every woman in this country must be aware that it's most important that they check their medicine cabinet and that they do not take this drug.
Now, there are two different stories about how this all started. The official story goes like this. In the early 1950s, the Swiss company Ciba was working on a new tranquilizer drug for animals. The hope was to create something that was less harmful than what was currently on the market. During this research, they synthesized thalidomide in 1953. But by 1954, they had already abandoned this drug because it did not have the intended result in animals. Now, that would have been the end of it. But unfortunately, this is where the German company Chemez Grünenthal comes in. They had a team of scientists that were doing research with glutamic acid, and thalidomide was rediscovered as a byproduct. So, if you research how thalidomide was created, that is the story you'll find. But dig a little deeper and you'll discover that there has always been an alternative theory, and that is that thalidomide was actually developed during the Second World War and was tested on concentration camp victims. For decades, Grünenthal denied this, and they insisted that their research director, Heinrich Muchter, was the one who had discovered and developed thalidomide in the 1950s. But in the early 2000s, new documents were uncovered dated 1944 and 1946, which contradict the company's claims and confirm the long-held suspicion that thalidomide was developed by Nazis who tested the drug in concentration camps. And the pieces of this puzzle really start to fit together when you learn a little bit more about the people behind Grünenthal. The company's founder, Hermann Wirtz Sr., was a Nazi party member and had a full dream team of Nazi scientists working for him, which we'll talk specifics on that in just a little bit, but for now, let's stay in the 1950s. So, in 1954, the company patents thalidomide and then starts trying to find a use for it, which may seem backwards, but this is often how the pharmaceutical industry works. It didn't take long for them to discover that thalidomide worked as a sedative for humans, and it seemed like the perfect sedative. Firstly, it produced a deep sleep that did not leave patients with any type of hungover feeling the next morning. And secondly, there was no risk of dependency with this drug. So, win-win. They wanted to rush this product to the market as quickly as possible, and so they started testing it on mice, as one does. And much to their delight, no matter how much they gave the mice, it didn't kill them. So in 1956, the medication is released under the brand name Contagon, and Grünenthal passes out samples to their employees with the messaging that these pills were completely safe. I mean, you couldn't even give a mouse enough of it to kill them. So it was pretty much safe for everyone to consume. But then, of course, you had that fateful Christmas day in 1956 when a baby was born in a small town in Germany without any ears. The baby's father was a Grünenthal employee who had been given a sample of thalidomide that he then gave to his pregnant wife. Now, it's unclear how or when the family made the connection between thalidomide and the baby's lack of ears. I wasn't really able to find a whole lot of specifics to verify how much the company actually knew, but we do know that this was brought to Grünenthal's attention and they simply chose to ignore it. We also know that this child was the first of at least 6 drug-injured babies born to Grünenthal employees after their mothers took thalidomide. The general consensus is that Grünenthal was clued into the fact that something might not be right with these pills, but even so, 9 months later in October of 1957, Grünenthal started selling the pills to the general public with their marketing focused on people with epilepsy. However, they quickly realized that this market just wasn't big enough and that they were going to need to pivot in order to expand into a larger market. And this led to further research, which led to the discovery that thalidomide had the added benefit of reducing or stopping nausea and vomiting. So, Grünenthal put together a very aggressive sales team who claimed that Contagon was a safe sedative, especially for pregnant women who were suffering from morning sickness. Sales went through the roof. They had found their market, and Grünenthal's owners and executives made a fortune practically overnight. But unfortunately, this drug was never tested for safety in pregnancy. They simply said it was safe for pregnant women, and pregnant women took it. Now, while this seems outrageous to us now, I do have to mention that back in the 1950s, most medications were not tested specifically to see if they were safe during pregnancy or not. And this is because there was the false understanding that a pregnant woman could take any medication and it would not cross the placental barrier. And by the end of the 1950s, Contagon was one of the best-selling sedatives in Germany. It was relatively cheap and available without a prescription. And it wouldn't just be Germany. Through licensing, thalidomide was produced and sold internationally by 14 pharmaceutical companies in 46 countries under 37 different product names. In 1958, the British pharmaceutical company, the Distillers Company, was granted a license to sell the medication and started producing and selling the drug to customers across the UK, New Zealand, and Australia under the brand name Distaval, and they too aimed their marketing towards pregnant women to combat the effects of morning sickness. Distillers' marketing directly stated, quote, Distaval can be given with complete safety to pregnant women and nursing mothers without adverse effect on the mother or the child. End quote. In some markets, this drug was even touted as some sort of miracle cure-all, kind of like the magic potions of years past. By the end of the 1950s, roughly 14 tons of these pills were being sold per year. It became one of the best-selling medications, second only to aspirin. And this meant that Grünenthal was rolling in the dough. But among the medical community, there started to be some concerns. There were reports of multiple people who had taken this medication and started to experience peripheral neuritis, which is where the nerves of the brain and spinal cord are damaged, and it causes things like tingling, numbness, pain, and weakness in the hands and feet. And even worse, there was a noticeable spike in miscarriages, stillbirths, and babies being born with birth defects. Now, we'll talk more about these birth defects in a few minutes, but all of these deformities were very specific, and those who were connecting the dots started referring to these babies as thalidomide babies. In 1958, Carl Beck, a German pediatrician, published his theory about the increase in deformities, in a local newspaper. He claimed that these deformities were likely due to nuclear weapons testing. Basically, he was blaming all of this on fallout from the Cold War. But the problem was, during all of this time, both East and West Germany were increasing in nuclear weapons testing, but East Germany had never approved thalidomide for use, and none of these deformed babies were being born there. While in West Germany, where the pills were sold at a rate of 15,000 pills per month, 5,000 children had been born deformed. In 1960, after getting reports of patients who were experiencing these nerve issues, Grünenthal ended up placing an insert in the medication box warning of side effects, including prickling and sensation of numbness in the hands and or feet. But the correlation between birth defects and this medication wasn't taken as seriously, which I find incredibly odd because it was a much larger issue, but at the same time, maybe that's why they ignored it. In England, the Distillers Company had started to receive reports of deformed babies as well, but they had been assured by Grünenthal that the drug was completely safe and they continued to sell the pills. Now, some people like to point out that it may not be all that surprising that Grünenthal didn't take the birth defect claims seriously when you consider who this company had working for them. So, we already mentioned that Grünenthal's owner, Hermann Wirtz, was a member of the Nazi Party. But as it turns out, he had joined the local Nazi Party in his hometown before the start of the Second World War, and for his loyalty, Hitler had handsomely rewarded him. His company had been given a contract from the German army to supply them with soap and detergent. He had also been supplied with slave workers to make the products and even handed 2 companies that had been taken from Jewish people who had either owned or controlled them. This meant that the Wirtz family companies thrived during the war. And it sounds as though they continued to hire people with a very particular ideology even after the war had ended. One German historian who looked at the short list of Grünenthal staff from the early 1960s said that it is absolutely astonishing that a small company should have such a concentration of convicted war criminals on its staff. He felt that this was unusual even by the standards of post-war Germany. Grünenthal's research director, Heinrich Muchter, had served as a Nazi doctor. His job during the war was to develop vaccines that he then tested on Jewish prisoners in the Grünenthal concentration camp. Basically, they would inject prisoners with the disease and then inject them with their experimental vaccine to see how the disease responded. Unsurprisingly, many of his test subjects died from the experimental medications that they were given. After the war, Muchter joined Grünenthal, and 9 years later is when they claimed that he discovered thalidomide. And Muchter received a bonus for every single thalidomide pill that was sold worldwide, which meant he became a very rich man. Like, obscenely rich. By 1961, it's reported that Muchter was making 20 times his annual salary just in bonuses from the sale of these thalidomide pills. Another top Grünenthal executive was Otto Ambros, who was known as the Devil's Chemist. You're probably familiar with this guy. We did talk about him in this video, which you may not have seen because YouTube censored it, but this guy was one of the paperclip scientists that we talk about in that video, which was a group of Nazi war criminals that the US government brought over to the US to help develop technology. So if you guys are interested in that story and you haven't seen it, you can go and check that one out after you finish this episode. But Ambros is most famous for being Hitler's advisor on chemical warfare and producing deadly nerve gases that were, of course, then used to kill thousands of people. He was found guilty at Nuremberg of mass murder and enslavement and sentenced to 8 years in prison. But he was set free after only 4 years by U.S. Commissioner John McCloy, who also restored Ambros's substantial wealth back to him. And after that, Ambros found no shortage of job offers, including from Dow Chemical, J. Peter Grace, and the U.S. Army's Chemical Corps. And in 1971 is when he became chairman of Grünenthal's board of directors. Now, for the sake of time, we won't get into the rest of the Nazis that worked for this company, but there were quite a few who were very well known for their work in eugenics, which kind of ties back in perfectly with all of the rest of this. Now, at the beginning of the episode, I talked about the documents that were uncovered in the 2000s. These documents were unearthed by Dr. Martin Johnson, the director of the Thalidomide Trust, and he claims that these documents suggest that thalidomide was created as an antidote to nerve toxins, including sarin, and was actually developed by Otto Ambros rather than Heinrich Muchter. And Dr. Johnson says that it now appears increasingly likely that thalidomide was the last war crime of the Nazis. He also added that the patent filed by Grünenthal in 1954 indicated that it had already been tested on humans, and this was before official tests ever began. Another document found by an Argentinian writer, Carlos de Napoli, appears to show the drug was tested in the death camps. Now, I won't bore you guys with the full list of details, but for all my nerds who want to know the full proof behind these claims, I'll have it listed down below. It is pretty convincing to me. So the question is, what do you think people with these types of backgrounds and human experiments who were making massive amounts of money off of this medication would do once they heard reports of devastating side effects? Well, with all of that context, you may not be surprised to hear they basically did nothing, just continued to sell more and more of these pills. Now, one of the things that really makes this feel like an extension of the Nazi experiments is the fact that in the 1950s, thalidomide was tested on 140 disabled children at the University Clinic in West Germany. 7 of these children were less than 1 year old. The parents were not asked for their permission, nor were they informed that their children were being treated with an entirely new sedative. Doses used were 11 to 20 times higher than the recommended dose for adults. So of these children who were given these high doses of thalidomide, a 3-month-old baby died from heart failure, a 21-month-old baby temporarily lost her vision, 1 child had a circulatory collapse, 1 died from a congenital heart defect, and half the children were mentally disturbed or had brain damage. The doctor responsible finally stopped using the drug when he heard that his medical colleagues had similar experiences with thalidomide. So, in addition to causing miscarriages and stillbirths, mothers who took thalidomide during their pregnancy started giving birth to babies who had a condition known as phocomelia, which is Greek for seal arms, and results in various abnormalities in the face, limbs, ears, and leads to other underdevelopments. Now, while this is a rare condition that can happen, it was determined that in these infants, it was caused by the pharmaceuticals that their mothers had taken. And this would eventually become known as thalidomide syndrome. With this syndrome, it is common for babies to have flipper-like appendages due to underdevelopment. This can affect 1, 2, or even all 4 limbs. Some babies are born completely missing their arms, legs, or both. Then, of course, you had the other deformities where babies were born without ears or blind, as well as other devastating organ defects, which could include undeveloped or malformed organs or just completely missing organs. Like some of these babies were born without lungs, like they just never grew lungs. Deformities also extended to the urinary tract, genitals, and digestive tract. This stuff was nasty. And what I find truly disturbing is the fact that these birth defects could have been caused by a mother having taken just 1 of these pills. 1 single pill taken for nausea, and you have a baby that's born with devastating defects. Years later, once the side effects of thalidomide were more well known, Dr. George Summers, chief pharmacologist at Distillers Company in the UK, started testing on rabbits. And he released a paper in 1962 showing a link between fetal abnormalities and thalidomide. Repeated experiments all showed the damage that this drug could inflict, and it was determined that the damage only occurred in a very short window during the first 42 years. That's how it feels when you're pregnant. It was determined that the damage could only occur in a very short window during the first 42 days of early pregnancy. And the earlier the mother took this drug during pregnancy, the more drastic the birth deformities. If taken from the 20th day of pregnancy, central brain damage could be caused. Day 21 could damage the eyes, day 22 the ears and face, day 24, the arms, and leg damage could occur if taken up to day 28. If a mother took one of these pills after the 42nd day of pregnancy, it was said to have little or no effect on the baby at all. Unfortunately, as we all know, the beginning part of pregnancy is when the majority of these women would have been looking for relief from morning sickness, which is just so sad. This was clearly a terrible drug that had devastated the lives of thousands of families across Germany and the UK, and thousands of American babies were headed for the same fate, except for the actions of one woman. Dr. Frances Kelsey was a Canadian-born pharmacologist who had just joined the Federal Drug Administration when she received an application to bring thalidomide into the American market. The application came from Richardson Merrill, one of the oldest pharmaceutical companies in the country. They too promoted thalidomide as completely safe even during pregnancy, just like all the other companies. And just like the other companies, Merrill had nothing to back up these claims of safety. So Dr. Kelsey kept sending their application back, telling them that it was substandard. The testing was not there to prove their claims of safety. She kept referring back to the fact that people were reporting numbness and nerve issues after taking thalidomide, and she insisted that further studies needed to be done. These companies need to try to figure out why people were having these side effects before just releasing it onto the market. And she also requested that they send her proof that this drug wouldn't cause damage to any unborn babies. She wanted them to prove to her that this drug was safe, which of course, Merrill could not. Doing the studies that Dr. Kelsey was requesting would have cost them money that they did not want to spend. So instead of doing this testing, they just applied as much pressure on Dr. Kelsey as they could. They contacted the FDA 50 times. They went behind her back to her superiors. They complained about her in writing, and they even threatened libel proceedings. They just would not stop. But neither would Dr. Kelsey. She refused to be intimidated. Now, at the time, the FDA could only withhold approval for 60 days at a time, and so Dr. Kelsey had to be pretty active working on preventing this medication from entering the American market. For more than 1 year, she would request further information from the distributor every 60 days to prevent thalidomide from getting through the system. And every 60 days, they didn't have it. In this way, Dr. Kelsey was successfully able to prevent this medication from getting FDA approval long enough for the issues with it to come out into the open. Unfortunately, while Dr. Kelsey was able to prevent FDA approval for thalidomide, she couldn't fully stop it from getting onto the American market. In 1960, Merrill was allowed to conduct clinical trials on patients across the country. But this wasn't a clinical trial at all. It was just a marketing campaign that was made to look like a clinical trial. And this is according to Michael Makazanik, who is an Australian lawyer and former investigative reporter who has spent years researching this disaster and working with victims. And he says that Merrill's whole objective was to get doctors familiar with the medication so that once they got approval from the FDA, everything would be good to go and they could just hit the ground running with getting their medication out there. So during this time, Merrill handed out 2.5 million pills to thousands of doctors across the US and Canada, calling it a clinical trial. This has got to be the biggest loophole that I have ever heard of. I can't imagine that this could have possibly fallen under the legal definition of a clinical trial. I don't know. I don't know enough about it. But if that was legal, hopefully that's something that has been remedied since then, because that is wild. So, although thalidomide was never officially sold in the USA, it's believed that roughly 20,000 people were given thalidomide and at least 17 children were born with defects. Which is 17 too many, but still, 17 versus the potential thousands. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy presented Dr. Frances Kelsey with the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service for her incredible work in protecting the American public. Unfortunately, the Canadian government wasn't as rigid as Dr. Kelsey and simply approved the medication. Canadian Dr. Clyde Murphy, one of the doctors who was sent samples of thalidomide, says that he was sent 1,000 pills. And apparently that was a pretty common amount that they were sending to doctors.
We received it in quantities like 1,000 pills. There was tremendous pressure all over the world to get this wonderful new drug on the market.
Now, pretty quickly, Dr. Murphy was concerned about the possible side effects of this drug, but his wife, who was pregnant with their fourth child, had been prescribed these pills by her own personal doctor. And so when she went into labor, Dr. Murphy gave the nurses at the hospital a heads up that this baby might be born with some problems. Sure enough, when it came time for the baby to be delivered and they arrived at the hospital, he said the nurses had his wife on a stretcher and they just gave him this horrified look. And so he said he rushed in to help. The baby had been presenting as a breech birth and something wasn't right with the limbs. And so the baby was kind of stuck half in and half out.
You see, because of his lack of legs, of a small bum, and his large head there, he was stuck on the stretcher with just his bottom. So the nurse got me a pair of forceps and I delivered him. And if I hadn't been there, he never would have made it.
Now, as Grünenthal continued getting reports of thalidomide causing issues in newborns and adults alike, they continued to brush the complaints off as some type of rare allergic reaction. At least, that's what they did publicly. Privately, they set out to investigate. Not to get to the bottom of it, but to put complainants under surveillance. It's believed that this was done with the intention of discrediting and intimidating the victims. In 1961, Grünenthal reluctantly applied to have this medication become prescription only. I guess that's something, but how about pull these pills off the shelves and quit making them? In late 1961, an Australian midwife, Pat Sparrow, started noticing a surprising number of children being born with limb defects. Of course, she had seen birth defects before, but this recent spike caused concern, especially since she was able to pinpoint that this uptick in defects seemed to have started after Dr. William McBride had started prescribing thalidomide to mothers at the Crown Street Hospital in Sydney. She brought her concerns to Dr. McBride, who initially did not share her concerns. But after he delivered 3 deformed babies within only a few months, he started to second guess his position and he alerted the distillers company, but they claimed that they never received his warnings. Luckily, Dr. McBride did not leave it there. He wrote a letter to The Lancet, which you may know is a weekly peer-reviewed general medical journal, and the letter raised his concerns and asked if anyone else in the medical community had seen a sudden increase in birth defects after prescribing thalidomide to their patients. His letter was only 5 sentences long, but was sufficient enough to prompt further research within the wider medical community. Doctors in Europe really started looking into this, and within months, the link between thalidomide and the rise in abnormal births was considered proven. Thalidomide was removed from shelves in Australia, New Zealand, and in the UK. By this point, thousands of infants had been born with birth defects, with nearly 40% of them having passed away. Now, around the same time in West Germany, Dr. Lenz, the director of human genetics at the University of Hamburg, had also started to notice an astounding increase in the number of deformed babies being born. Dr. Lenz was also an ex-Nazi Party member, but his concerns led him to discover that as early as 1956, a baby had been born with deformities likely caused by thalidomide, leading him to believe that thalidomide had to be the cause of these issues in his patients as well. So he contacts Grünenthal and speaks directly to Heinrich Muchter and says, "Look, I have a really strong suspicion that something just isn't right here. I have these 14 cases of birth deformities, and I think it could only be thalidomide. I think we really need to pull this medication." However, instead of taking this seriously, Grünenthal decides that they're going to send out 66,000 letters to German doctors to say that this drug was safe. So even though at this point they knew that it was likely that this drug was causing deformities and death, they still doubled down saying that it's safe. Fortunately, Dr. Lenz had a mounting pile of evidence that he had collected, and after 10 days of arguing their points, the press found out about all of this. And only then, the day after the thalidomide scandal made headlines in West Germany, did Grünenthal reluctantly withdraw the drug from the German market on November 28, 1961. And distributors in other countries followed suit. If Grünenthal had only taken these concerns more seriously and pulled the pills from the market just a few months sooner, even as late as April of 1961, the number of victims could have been cut in half. Now, sadly, in Canada, thalidomide continued to be sold even after it was withdrawn from the German market. The Food and Drug Administration in Canada issued no warnings to the public, and the drug remained on the shelf until 4 months later when Canada finally got with the program and pulled the pills off the market. And even worse, Spain, who was one of the last countries to remove thalidomide from the market, it was available there until the early 1970s. So they were seriously behind. So once thalidomide was removed from shelves, scientists still had no idea why this medication was causing these problems. Now, without getting too nerdy and pretending I know about all this chemistry stuff, which I clearly don't, the nutshell version of this whole thing is that thalidomide is a molecule made up of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen atoms arranged in rings. But what's special about it is that it's a type of molecule that has two versions. Like a left hand and a right hand, they look the same, but they're mirror images of each other. In the same way that your hands look basically identical to each other with the same number of fingers, but you can never perfectly match them up, these two versions of the molecule can't be perfectly lined up either. So essentially, as basic as I can make something that I don't fully understand myself, even though the mirror image versions of thalidomide are the same atoms and connected the same way, the arrangement is different, and this means that the way your body reacts to them is also different. And this is because your body's receptors are very picky about the shapes of molecules. In the case of thalidomide, the right-hand version, or the S version, helped with morning sickness, but the left-hand version, or the R version, caused serious birth defects. Of course, this was not something that scientists knew at that time, but would later discover. Now, an example of this type of thing happening with another drug is in methamphetamine, which is kind of a really hardcore thing, but only the R version can break bad, if you will, while the S version is sold in over-the-counter vapor inhalers, and it's not the same as the dangerous drug that the R version is. Once scientists discovered this, they tried to isolate the R version of thalidomide so that the medication could be used for morning sickness without the risk of birth defects. But as it turns out, with thalidomide, the R version can switch to the S version inside the human body. So even if they isolated it in this way, it would still not be safe for pregnant patients to take. Now, with the exception of Spain and Canada, most countries only sold thalidomide between the years of 1957 and 1961. But in that time, this drug is believed to have caused at least 90,000 miscarriages. Of course, we can never know that full number. And between 10,000 and 20,000 severely deformed infants. For babies affected by thalidomide, around 40% died within the first year. And this was attributed mostly to severe internal malformations. In many cases, the children who did survive had drastically shortened life expectancies. And in all cases, their deformities made simple day-to-day tasks incredibly difficult. While there were some prosthetics available at the time, they were quite rudimentary, and while some survivors found these devices helpful, it kind of seemed to depend on how severe their condition was, and many found prosthetics just to be too difficult to get used to, and even quite dangerous. Now, we'll never know the full number of how many lives were affected because of those thousands or even millions of pills that were passed out as samples, because these samples were not tracked, meaning it's highly possible that there are many other victims that are not included in these numbers. One thing is for certain, this was the worst drug-related catastrophe in history. It's really hard to wrap my head around just how drastically these conditions affected thousands of families. The parents of these children who survived now had the extremely difficult task of taking care of them. I had some footage for you guys of Lynette Rowe and her family and how incredibly diligent her parents were and how much hard work it was to take care of her. But unfortunately, I got copyright strikes on it, so I had to just include some still shots of the family here. They had these individual spoons they had to put food on for her to be able to take a bite, and she could spin it with her mouth and eat. And because she has no arms or legs, she can't go to the bathroom by herself or anything like that. So her mom has to get up with her in the middle of the night to turn her and things like that. Her mom jokes about how she would talk to young mothers who complain about waking up with their babies, and she says she's been doing it for 54 years. Of course, these are kind of older clips, but I just thought that the love her parents had for her is just so evident in these clips and just so beautiful to see. Of course, living like this is a huge sacrifice, and some of the parents didn't think they could do it and committed suicide, or even abandoned their children who were then raised in institutional settings. Now, I did see one case where an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Law, adopted a little boy that had been abandoned, which, to think about someone just willingly signing up for a child who wasn't even a blood relative.
Took one look and I thought, no wonder nobody wanted him. And the next time I went to see him, of course, they had him bathed and dressed, and he didn't look too bad at all.
Well, I wasn't in favor of taking him at all. No way. We'd raised our family, and that was it. But it was a baby with nobody wanted him, so what are you going to do? Turned out okay.
What a special couple. It's reported that doctors and midwives were killing disabled children in the delivery rooms on a large scale in Britain and Germany. And it's speculated that this was probably happening in other countries as well. There was a woman in Belgium who decided that her armless daughter's life was hopeless. Now, it wasn't just the lack of arms. This poor baby's insides were obviously a complete mess because her bowels were emptying through her genital tract rather than the hole that waste is supposed to come out of. So at first, the medical staff wouldn't let this woman see her baby. But after a week, they kind of ran out of excuses, and she finally saw just how badly deformed her child was. And this is when she, her mother, and her sister all come up with a plan together that they would overdose this baby on sedatives. The family doctor agreed to the plan and wrote the prescription. They all saw this as a sort of mercy killing because of how severely deformed this little girl was. Now, it's not believed that the baby's father had much of a say in any of this, but when the pediatrician shared his suspicions with the police that this baby had not died of natural causes, the mother was arrested and charged with murder. Her husband, mother, sister, and the family doctor were all tried with her for conspiracy. Now, these defendants never denied the facts of the killings. They only argued that it was better than letting this baby live in the condition that she was in, which is this is really, honestly, so horrifying. The prosecution demanded conviction, but recommended leniency. Honestly, I feel like the prosecution doesn't seem like they even wanted to charge them. They kind of just had to because it's the law, but the defense asked for an acquittal, blaming, quote, a poisoned gift from modern science, end quote. Even the coroner on this case was quoted as having said that had he been in the autopsy room alone, he would have marked down that this baby had died from natural causes. I think a lot of this is that most of them couldn't imagine that this poor baby would have lived very long in the condition that she was in. The court admitted an evidence stack of letters supporting the defendants, and a public opinion poll came back 10-1 in favor of the defendant. At week's end, the jury of 12 men took only 105 minutes to reach its verdict: not guilty. As thalidomide injured children began to grow up, everyday life decisions, ones most of us take for granted, became major points of discussion. Once they reached school age, the big question was, what kind of school should these children attend? Some experts advocated that these children go to special needs schools that were for children with disabilities, while others pushed for integrating them into regular schools. There was a belief that being around their peers in a typical environment would help them adapt better to real-world challenges. And there were many parents who were deeply afraid of sending their children to institutions for the disabled. The memory of what had happened not so long ago, when children were taken to such places and never returned, was still fresh. One woman, who was born with phocomelia affecting one arm, recalled how her mother always made her special ponchos to hide her limb difference. As a child, she didn't fully understand why, but as she grew older, she learned about the horrors of World War II and how her mother had lived near a hospital that had been one of the ones the Nazis had used as an extermination site. She knew this as a place where disabled children were among the first group to be taken and killed. And that fear never left her. At the time, many people affected by thalidomide faced significant stigma. It was really heartbreaking for me to think about the fact that these children were made to feel ashamed of their differences, even by their own parents. But when you consider what these parents had just lived through only a few decades earlier, the fear and instinct to hide their children away becomes a lot more understandable. It's not like they were ashamed of their children. Maybe some of them were, but the majority of them were really just afraid for their children. They didn't know what was going to happen if people found out about them. Some of these children, of course, were so severely disabled, they were missing both arms or legs, or maybe arms and legs, and their parents really didn't have a whole lot of choices. No matter how creative or determined they were, the physical limitations were immense, and caregiving to these children was a full-time responsibility. But what struck me the most, both sadly and beautifully, was how much a parent's reaction to this hardship would ultimately shape how this child saw themselves and their life overall. One woman shared the story of how her family had told her exactly what happened when she came home from the hospital, and they told her all about how her siblings had been frightened by her appearance. Some of her siblings told her later how they were really upset, and when they ripped the blanket off and saw she had no legs, they said, "Take her away, that's not my sibling." And she said it was so painful to hear. I'm not sure why her family felt the need to tell her what had been said, but you can really see in her face how deeply that had hurt her and how it affected her for the rest of her life. But then you had these other families who reacted with love and unconditional acceptance, parents and siblings who embraced the child completely. Like, this is our son, this is our daughter, this is our sibling, and we love and support them just as they are. You remember the doctor that we talked about, the one whose wife was prescribed thalidomide by another doctor, Dr. Murphy? He was talking about how telling his kids about their sibling and how obviously very emotional for him. He was like tearing up talking about it. But the way that his children responded was just so touching. I saw an interview with Dr. Paul Murphy where he talks about how devastated he was that his son was born with, he says no legs, but really he has like the flipper arms and legs that are typical of a thalidomide baby, and how he was just so concerned about having to tell his other 3 children, and how surprised he was at their reaction when they just told him, "Daddy, you got to bring that baby home." That kind of support made a world of difference, and it's just so evident when you compare the stories of these survivors side by side, how different it was for those who had that foundation. And along these same lines, What really stood out to me was how a parent responded and basically presented this to their child, how much that affected the kid. I watched a few interviews where you can see that the person's carrying a lot of pain and they seemed weighed down by it, even like depressed, which of course is a completely understandable reaction, but it almost seemed to be directly correlated to like if their parents reacted that way. But then you see others with similar challenges whose parents had really pushed them to do more, to believe in themselves, and the contrast was mind-blowing. I also found it so inspiring the way that some of these survivors really just took all of these challenges head on, like the Laws, who encouraged their son to train his toes to work like fingers. As a young child, Alvin was given manual tasks to do with his toes for hours at a time until eventually he gained the dexterity that he would normally have in his hands and his toes. He could feed himself, he could write, he could play piano, play the drums. You should go look up videos of him because, again, I got copyright striked, but it is incredible what he was able to do. And he does say, obviously it was a lot of hard work. It was very frustrating and lonely at times, but he credits his parents as pushing him to do that in a way that enabled him to really feel as though he no longer had a disability because he could fully dress himself and even drive. This was really a good reminder to me as a parent myself, the impact that we can have when we choose to just believe in our children and encourage them even in the most dire of situations. And of course, we have the age-old question of nature versus nurture, because you have some of these people who really just seemed as though they had amazing attitudes from day one. They just weren't going to let anything hold them back. And their supportive parents were just truly the icing on the cake. Schulte Hillen's mother says that being born with short arms never held her son back. She said he was fearless from the very beginning. And he says, sure, he has short arms, but that's never held him back from doing anything that he wants to do. It's frustrating at times, but all he has to do is make adjustments, and he doesn't see himself as disabled. I found all of this to be a powerful reminder that life is not just about what happens to us, but how we respond to it. While many of these survivors went on to live very full and productive lives despite their struggles, there was still the very real need for financial support. Some required full-time nursing care, especially those who were being cared for by aging parents. And many faced ongoing health issues that required costly medications and treatments. Someone needed to pay for this care, and it only seemed right that it would be the ones who caused this crisis in the first place. All throughout the discovery of thalidomide's horrific side effects, Grünenthal vehemently denied liability. As the years went on, they claimed that they were just following the standards for that day and age. But critics point out that Dr. Kelsey at the FDA somehow knew to ask these questions, so why weren't they asking them? Or at least taking her concerns more seriously. The accusations were that since 1956, the company actively ignored multiple warning signs and just tried to hide behind the fact that they had conducted the relevant and industry standard tests on rodents. In March of 1968, after 6 years of investigations in Germany, criminal charges were finally brought against the owner and 8 top executives of Grünenthal. The charges brought against the company included criminal negligence, premeditated bodily harm, and manslaughter. Throughout all of this, the company was largely uncooperative, and in fact, they repeatedly referred to the deaths of thousands of children as mere acts of God. Alongside the 9 senior executives, there were 451 co-plaintiffs and 351 witnesses prepared to testify against them. The prosecution had brought over 70,000 pages of evidence. And Grünenthal didn't come to play either. They arrived with a team of 40 lawyers. But 2.5 years into the trial, everything came to an abrupt halt. In a shocking move, the state and prosecution reached a secret settlement with the company, claiming that continuing the trial was not in the public interest. Like, what? Are you kidding me? Under the terms of this agreement, the prosecution's extensive evidence was sealed from public access. All criminal charges were dropped. The company agreed to provide victims with lifetime pensions ranging from just $30 to $140 a month, plus small one-time payments. What is that even going to get them? In order to receive compensation, victims had to waive their right to pursue future legal action. And possibly the most outrageous and infuriating part of all of this is that under this deal, 2,554 of the most severely affected German families were slapped with a gag order. Meaning, of course, that they were legally barred from speaking publicly about what had happened to them. Are these guys serious? Really? The 9 men who were charged were freed and were granted immunity from any further prosecution. After all that, Grünenthal essentially walked away with what can barely even be called a slap on the wrist. Now, there's a piece of this puzzle that might just bring this all home for you. And that is, in 1966, 2 years before charges were filed, but 4 years into the state's investigation, the owner of Grünenthal's personal lawyer suddenly resigned. Not long after that, he became justice minister in the very Providence where the trial would later take place. So just in case you guys aren't getting this, the man who once defended the company in private was now working for the government, overseeing the very legal system that was supposed to hold this company accountable. If that is not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is. As a result of this shady settlement, no individual person was ever officially named responsible for the worst pharmaceutical disaster in history. Instead, Grünenthal was ordered to contribute to a fund for those affected by thalidomide, a fund that the German government also paid into, and that raises another huge question for me, like why? Why was the government helping foot the bill when this company had made billions? Why wasn't Grünenthal fully responsible for covering every single cost that these victims ever had for the rest of their lives? Many people harmed by thalidomide are still alive today. Some, like Lynette Rowe, have required full-time care for their entire lives, almost as if they never left the infant stage. But even so, they are so loved and cherished. And as I mentioned, many have gone on to live full lives and achieve great things. They've been successful musicians, artists, speakers, and even doctors. Schulte Hillen credits following his dreams in life to his mother. He says that she always told him he could be whatever he wanted to be. And when he came up with the idea that he wanted to be a doctor, other people told him that it was a terrible idea. They told him he should pick something else because there was going to be too many problems with that path. But his mother told him to follow his own path and do what he wanted to do because he could do whatever he put his mind to. And he is now an emergency room doctor in Switzerland. Thalidomide survivors are active parts of their communities, finding love, raising families, and campaigning for causes that are important to them. They are also the ones leading the charge for compensation for those affected by this deadly drug. In England, 97 families got together to sue Distillers, the British company that was distributing the drug, and Distillers made a ridiculously low offer of compensation and warned that the money would only be paid out if all of the families agreed to the lifetime deal. 5 families, led by wealthy London art dealer David Mason, refused this deal. Now, people were not happy that David was convincing people to hold out for a better deal. He was even getting threats on his life to settle. And a lot of this pressure was coming from the other families included in the lawsuit because they just wanted to get what they could get and move on with their lives. But David knew that they could get a lot more than what they were being offered, and so he pushed forward. Now, David's daughter, Louise, was very visually injured by thalidomide. She had the typical deformities in all 4 of her limbs, and this made her the perfect poster child for this lawsuit. When people saw her, they felt very empathetic towards this cause. Now, sadly, Louise lived in a handicap center. Louise says that the moment her dad laid eyes on her in the delivery room, he said, "My God, you're not going to let this baby live, are you?" The doctor said yes. but they recommended for her parents to place her in a handicapped home to live, which they did. She said that at first they would come and visit her, but it was quite a drive from home. And so over time, they stopped coming to see her. And it got to the point that she would only see her family for 3 weeks out of the year. And much of that was just so that her dad could take her around so that people could see her in order to gain support for this lawsuit. And her story is just so incredibly sad. The other children in the home were very cruel to her. And at one point, she was even raped by another classmate. If you stop and think about that for a second, this little girl had no arms and no legs, and someone does that to her. Even worse, she told one of the nurses at the school what had happened to her. They found her undergarments with blood on them, and yet they did nothing about it. Ultimately, David Mason's efforts resulted in the families getting 6 times the original offer. Louise says she paid a heavy price, but she's glad that it resulted in the families getting the financial support that they needed. In the UK, the Thalidomide Trust was set up in 1973 and won £28 million from the British distributor of this drug, a sum that was later bolstered by another £20 million from the UK government in 2009. An apology was also given in Parliament later that same year. In Canada, 25 years after the Canadian government had promised to look after the victims of thalidomide there, most had still not received a penny for their injuries. So in 1987, the War Amputees of Canada brought them to Ottawa, and unlike the German and English victims who had been kind of part of a community trying to get compensation all this time, the Canadian victims had spent those 25 years apart from each other. So this was the first time for many of them that they were meeting other victims. The Thalidomide Victims Association was formed. Now, Paul Murphy, who was the son of Dr. Murphy, the one who had been born breech, Paul was elected as the vice president for this association. And Alvin Law, he was the one who was adopted by the older couple, and they had taught him to do everything with his toes. He was elected as the recording secretary. After years of waiting, the victims of thalidomide were finally getting help.
After years of waiting, suffering, and fighting for compensation, Canadian victims of thalidomide are finally getting the help they need from the federal government. Yesterday, the health minister said survivors of the drug will receive lifelong pensions.
Individuals can now start feeling comfortable about their future. They know they have an amount of money coming in every year that can support them.
In other countries, victims were only offered about 10% of the money that they were asking for. And even then, it was offered to be paid out in small monthly stipends rather than in a lump sum. Essentially a slap in the face after everything they had been through. In Australia, Grünenthal and Diageo, the British company that had ended up buying distillers, were co-defendants in a multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit centered on the Lynette Rowe case. The company tried to move this court case to Germany, which means they wanted to have this woman who had no arms and no legs move to a different country where she didn't know the language for a case that was probably going to take at least 5 years. Grünenthal had this never give in, never admit defeat kind of attitude, whereas distillers, or Diageo as they were called now, took the much more compassionate, sensible approach to this case. Once they were convinced of the strength of the claim, they settled with Lynette. Grünenthal, however, didn't pay a cent of the settlement. Despite that, Lynette Rowe got a multi-million-dollar payout, which also allowed more than 100 others who were part of a class action lawsuit to also get their claims heard by Diageo. Lynette Rowe was seen smiling as she left the courthouse, and she said that she's pleased that others harmed by thalidomide will now have the chance to seek compensation as well. She said, "It's great that my case will bring about good things for other people too. It shows you don't need arms and legs to change the world." She said, "It's like I always say, see the person, not the disability." In a statement, Grünenthal said it would continue to defend itself against the litigation. Whatever, we don't care what you gotta say. A lawyer for the Rowe family said that this is a great outcome for a wonderful family, and while the amount of the settlement will remain private, he did confirm that it was a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and that this amount would be sufficient to provide a very good level of care for Lynette for the rest of her life. This scandal has left a very deep distrust between pregnant women in the medical community. To this very day, when something new comes out, like during COVID times, thalidomide is mentioned whenever the question comes up as to whether something is safe or not during pregnancy. I didn't even really know this particular story when I had my babies, but I'd heard horror stories about taking things while you're pregnant and how they could affect your pregnancy. And I didn't even really want to take Tylenol, which they claim is completely safe for pregnancy. And guess what? After I had my kids, the news came out that Tylenol possibly might be causing some neurological problems for babies. So, I mean, the distrust will always be there, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I do think there's a healthy level of skepticism that we should all have when it comes to anything that we put in our bodies, especially medications that have been made in a lab. And unfortunately, even after all of that, there were additional medications put out on the market that were causing similar birth defects as thalidomide. Luckily, because of the thalidomide tragedy, though, doctors started to look at these medications more closely. And one such medication was benedictine, which was causing similar issues as thalidomide with the shortened legs or flipper-like arms and legs. And sadly, it still took until 1983 for this medication to be pulled from the shelf. Now, if there is any good that came out of this tragedy, it is the huge changes that were made in the way that new drugs are tested and approved. No longer can the results of animal trials be considered sufficient in and of themselves to prove a drug is safe for use in humans. Doctors everywhere, of course, like I said, took a renewed interest in the side effects of drugs, and particularly they started to look at how drugs could pass across the placental barrier from mother to child in pregnant women. It's now recognized that with any new drugs, users must not only be monitored while taking the drug, but they should also be followed up with long after they've stopped taking it. Now, this wouldn't be the last that we would see of thalidomide. In 1964, it was discovered in Israel to have benefits in leprosy treatment. Starting in 1965, it was used as the first choice of treatment for leprosy in Brazil. However, this would unfortunately lead to at least 33 cases of children born with birth defects. By 1973, thalidomide was being used in 62 leprosy centers around the world. While this was great news for leprosy patients, unfortunately, this medication was still not being controlled at the level it should be. And by 2003, around 10,000 thalidomide-injured babies had been born in Brazil. In 1997, the Thalidomide Victims Association of Canada faced an agonizing choice. A small American company, Celgene, wanted to bring thalidomide back onto the market as a treatment for leprosy and cancer, but they needed the approval of the FDA, and so Celgene sought the support of Canadian victims for its application. It was a really hard choice to make, but the victims agreed that if this drug that had so devastated their lives could be properly controlled, who were they to stop it from helping someone else? In 1998, the FDA approved a thalidomide-based drug, but imposed the tightest rules for any drug in history. Officially, Celgene got approval as a treatment for leprosy, which was a very small market in America. And so they very quickly shifted on to using it as a treatment for multiple myeloma, which is a cancer of the blood cells. And they got approval for that use in 2006. So the numbers I found were from 2019, but at that time, Celgene was leading the market for a drug treatment of multiple myeloma in America and other European Union countries. They were selling its patented thalidomide derivative for about $10,000 per month or $333 a pill. Now, isn't that interesting? Because before it became a cancer drug, they said it was really cheap. And I mean, obviously this is a reformulation, but I don't know, it just kind of makes me wonder. In 1998, when they sought approval to bring thalidomide back onto the market, Celgene was valued at $100 million. And by 2019, they were worth $100 billion. In 2013, a major survey was done by a team of scientists who reviewed over 70 studies, and they concluded that any benefit from thalidomide was very small and the risks were very high. In 2012, victims finally got an apology from Grünenthal, an apology that many victims didn't find too sincere. The chief executive officer said, We ask for forgiveness that for nearly 50 years we didn't find a way for reaching out to you from human being to human being. We ask that you regard our long silence as a sign of the shock that your fate caused us. We wish that the thalidomide tragedy had never happened. We see both the physical hardship and the emotional stress that the affected, their families, and particularly their mothers had to suffer because of thalidomide and still have to endure day by day. Victims saw this statement as an apology for not reaching out sooner, but still not an admission of guilt or any kind of actual apology. The official stance of the company appears to still be basically the same as it had been all along. They regret that people got hurt, but the company's actions were consistent with the state of scientific knowledge and the prevailing standards of pre-marketing and testing of the pharmaceutical industries in the 1950s. Now, in addition to this non-apology apology, victims also felt it was telling that most of the stipend payments to victims came from the German government rather than from Grünenthal themselves. Now, Grünenthal no longer makes thalidomide and continues to deny any victims outside of Germany any compensations. Thalidomide lawsuits have been filed across the world over the years, and all three companies have now paid out settlements, many for millions of dollars. In 2010, the British government officially apologized to people hurt by the drug after having agreed to pay that 20 million pounds that I talked about earlier to thalidomide victims. Thalidomide survivors worldwide continue to fight for compensation as they battle with the continued side effects. Now, one of the things that I found incredibly sad about this is that in some of these cases where the thalidomide victims, the mothers had gotten the samples, because there was no paper trail proving they had taken this medication, they were denied compensation. I saw an interview with one lady who says that she had all types of tests done to prove this is what she was injured from. They were able to rule out anything else that could have caused her health problems other than thalidomide, but still the government would not take this, and she still has not been compensated. And she's very injured, this lady. She's not able to work, so it's just really a sad situation. The original thalidomide is still easy and cheap to manufacture and continues to be manufactured by multiple companies and governments to treat leprosy. Unfortunately, it is still mostly used in areas that do not enforce rigorous controls and regulations on medications, and as a result, thalidomide injured babies still continue to be born to this very day.